This is Nick. Welcome to GeoX, Global Intelligence Node. The United States says it's returning to negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. Many people see that as a sign of hope. I don't. I believe it's exactly the opposite. I believe these negotiations could become the final step toward a much larger catastrophe, not because peace is impossible, but because every major power involved is pursuing objectives that have nothing to do with peace itself. The war in Ukraine is only one battlefield inside a much larger struggle, a struggle over who will shape the next global order. Russia, the United States, Europe, China, none of them are acting in isolation. Behind the public speeches and diplomatic statements lies a far more dangerous geopolitical game. And if my assessment is correct, the return to negotiations may not reduce the risk of global war. It may simply postpone it, while making the eventual explosion even more destructive. Let's examine why. The United States, through Secretary of State Marco Rubio, has announced that it is returning to negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. At the same time, President Trump stated that peace will eventually be achieved, but both Russia and Ukraine will have to make concessions. Many people immediately welcomed these statements as good news. To them, it looked like a light had finally appeared at the end of a very dark tunnel. For weeks now, politicians, military experts, government officials, foreign ministers, presidents, and countless television commentators have been warning about an unstoppable escalation. Then suddenly, hope seems to return. I see it very differently. In my view, this is actually bad news. I believe these negotiations are far more likely to trigger an even greater escalation. The reason is simple. The current situation is becoming increasingly hopeless for the Kremlin leadership in the long run. That reality could eventually push them toward nuclear escalation. After all, their basic principle has remained unchanged for years. Why do we need a world if there is no Russia? More importantly, their political philosophy is built around another idea. If there is Russia, there must be Putin. Without Putin, there is no Russia. The specific individual could theoretically change, but the governing principle does not. Their vision of peace is acceptable only if they continue ruling Russia and retain significant influence over the future global order, consistent with their ambitions and strategic interests. That is the fundamental strategy shared by nearly the entire current Russian ruling class. They may disagree over tactical issues. They argue about Crimea. They argue over whether all of Donbass should be captured. They argue over relations with Europe. Some dream of returning to villas on Lake Como, estates in Tuscany, or apartments in Geneva. Others believe Europe should collapse because, in their view, it has already decayed. Those are merely tactical disagreements. On the central question, they remain united. They believe Russia must continue to be governed by their own political class. Even Putin himself could eventually be replaced, but the system and its ambitions would remain. The obvious question is this. Why don't we hear any fundamentally different views inside Russia? Because those voices have largely been eliminated from the country's political landscape. The radically pro-Western faction that advocated dismantling the Russian state, returning Crimea, prosecuting Russian officials for war crimes, and carrying out sweeping political purges no longer has meaningful influence inside Russia. Today, those positions survive almost exclusively among opposition figures living abroad. People like Garry Kasparov or Mikhail Khodorkovsky speak from exile. In my assessment, they have virtually no chance of shaping Russia's future. The same is true for another, much smaller group. Those who advocate dismantling the Russian state not in the interests of Kiev or Western governments, but in what they believe would benefit the peoples living inside Russia, remain an extremely marginal force. Their voices are even fewer. Their political influence is almost non-existent. Occasionally, one of them can still be heard somewhere on the Russian internet, but in practical political terms, they can safely be ignored. With that in mind, let's examine why. America's decision to return to negotiations could ultimately increase the risk of a third world war. The logic is actually straightforward. You cannot analyze negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, especially those involving the Trump administration, in isolation. They are only one part of a much larger global crisis, a struggle for leadership over the future international order. And that struggle extends far beyond the war in Ukraine. Even more importantly, The United States itself is deeply divided. The Trump administration does not represent a unified America. The broader Western world is split into two competing ideological camps. On one side stand what I would call the Euro-Atlantic establishment. That includes the Democratic Party in the United States, along with much of the progressive and liberal left political establishment across Europe. On the other side is the loosely defined MAGA camp. I say loosely defined because even that movement is far from unified. Inside the United States, it contains competing factions. Outside America, the differences become even greater. Trying to fit figures like Giorgia Meloni into the MAGA movement is difficult. She emerged from Italy's post-fascist political tradition. In France, you have Gaullists. In Germany, the Alternative for Germany. In Hungary, Viktor Orban. These movements differ from one another in many important ways. In fact, their differences often outweigh what they have in common. Yet despite those differences, they all oppose what they view as the Euro-Atlantic establishment. According to this interpretation, that establishment follows a long-term strategy aimed at maintaining global control. Its intellectual roots, I argue, go back to the 1970s, back to the ideas associated with the Club of Rome. Concepts such as zero economic growth, global convergence, the gradual political integration of humanity, a world in which America functions primarily as a center for finance, technology, and intellectual leadership, while Eurasia becomes the planet's primary industrial base. These ideas have been discussed extensively for decades. They can be found across countless books, reports, and public sources. But they are not my main focus here. What matters is something else. The real struggle is not taking place between the visible political leaders. Think of global politics as a chessboard. Donald Trump is one of the queens. From Russia's perspective, Vladimir Putin is another. There are bishops, rooks, knights, and pawns. Ukraine, for example, is a pawn. An important pawn, but still a pawn. These political figures certainly have personal ambitions, fears, and their own decision-making power. They are real people, but they are still only pieces on the board. The real players are those moving the pieces. In today's world, where politics is deeply intertwined with finance, information networks, multinational corporations, and global economic systems, the true centers of power are not the politicians performing before television cameras. Political leaders spend much of their time speaking to emotional audiences that often have only a limited understanding of the forces shaping international events. That is the role of public politics. But behind it stand much deeper structures. From the perspective of serious geopolitical analysis, those deeper structures coordinate political decisions around the interests of a relatively small group that controls an enormous share of global wealth. It is widely believed that roughly 1,000 influential families, operating through various financial, corporate, and institutional networks, control a substantial share of the Western world's economic power. From this perspective, political leaders often function as representatives rather than independent decision-makers. Take President Biden, for example. I would argue that he largely served as a public face rather than the real center of authority. The same applies to Kamala Harris. That does not mean they had no influence whatsoever. It means they performed a political role within a much larger system. Inside the Democratic Party, decisions about candidates and strategy are made by influential political groups operating behind the scenes. The Obama political network is one example. Republicans have their own powerful factions as well. But even those organizations are themselves only part of a much deeper structure. If you continue looking beneath the surface, you eventually arrive at what I describe as the highest level of influence. Those same networks of elite, families, and their representatives, operating across politics, finance, media, academia, and culture. This is what I consider the real deep state, not the version Donald Trump usually talks about. Trump often uses the term deep state to describe unelected government bureaucrats inside Washington. In my opinion, that definition fundamentally misunderstands the true structure of power. It reflects a serious misconception about how influence is actually organized. Within this deeper establishment, there are certainly competing factions, but despite their disagreements, they usually find ways to cooperate. Whenever their broader strategic interests align, viewed through that lens, Today's geopolitical landscape becomes easier to understand. There are Euro-Atlantic elites. There are conservative Western elites. Despite their internal competition, both ultimately face another major center of power, China. The Chinese Communist leadership represents a fundamentally different model of global development. It is not organically connected to the same network of Western elite families and institutions. Instead, it promotes its own long-term vision for the future international order. India also occupies an interesting position. Its political establishment maintains significant ties with Western institutions. Yet at the same time, it remains deeply rooted in India's own civilizational traditions, historical identity, and internal political structures. After all, India is home to more than 1.5 billion people. That alone makes it one of the defining forces shaping the 21st century. And unlike the United States, whose history spans only a few centuries, India carries thousands of years of cultural and political continuity. That historical depth also shapes the global balance of power. Against that backdrop, the war between Russia and Ukraine is only one battlefield within a much larger global struggle. It is one of several conflicts through which competing power centers are trying to shape the future international order. In my view, the most important battle today is not taking place on the battlefield. It is taking place in the race for artificial intelligence. That is where the future balance of power is being decided. At the moment, only two truly dominant centers exist: the United States and China. Even within the United States, there are competing groups. But despite their differences, they collectively represent America's technological bloc. Figures such as Elon Musk are part of that broader ecosystem competing with China. Other countries simply are not operating at the same level. That, in my opinion, reveals the real global balance of power, far more accurately than conventional geopolitical maps. At the same time, we should avoid believing simplistic success stories. Elon Musk is often portrayed as a self-made genius who rose from nothing to become one of the most influential people on Earth. Reality is considerably more complicated. He did not emerge from poverty. He did not begin life as an anonymous laborer who suddenly conquered the world. The true history is far more complex than the popular narrative suggests. The world itself is far more complicated than the simplified models presented in many university political science textbooks. All of this is unfolding during the gradual collapse of the existing international order. The current system, in its basic form, emerged after the Yalta Conference at the end of World War II. It survived the Cold War. It adapted after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. But today, that system is steadily breaking apart. Out of its ruins, the outlines of a completely new world order are beginning to emerge. And the struggle over what that future will look like is becoming increasingly intense. Wars are one of the instruments shaping that process. That includes the conflict between Iran and the United States. And it includes the war between Russia and Ukraine. At the deepest strategic level, I believe those two conflicts are closely connected.